Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we'll be exploring how Brazil transitioned from being a Portuguese colony to becoming a fully independent nation.
A fascinating journey indeed.
It is. And it's more complex than most people think.
Absolutely. Definitely not a simple revolution, that's for sure.
To guide us through this period, we're using pasted text, a detailed historical account that really dives deep into the people and events that shaped Brazilian independence.
It really does a great job of going beyond the usual textbook narrative.
Exactly. So get ready for some surprising twists and turns as we uncover the real story behind Brazil's independence.
I think listeners will be surprised by how much this period still impacts Brazil today. We'll be tracing those connections as we go. You know, the decisions made back then still ripple through the country's social and economic landscape.
That's what makes these deep dives so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Portugal claimed Brazil way back in 1500 when Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived.
Right. But it took a few decades for them to really get serious about colonizing it.
So when did things actually get going?
Well, in 1534, they implemented the captaincy system, dividing the territory into these, kind of like mini fiefdoms, ruled by Portuguese nobles.
Oh, interesting. So these nobles were essentially like mini-kings.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It was like Portugal was trying to outsource the whole colonial administration thing.
But it didn't quite work out as planned, did it? What went wrong?
Well, a lot of things, actually. Imagine trying to run a colony that's vast and wild.
I mean, Brazil is huge.
Exactly. So communication and control were a nightmare.
I bet.
On top of that, many of these captains, they were more interested in lining their own pockets than actually governing effectively.
So corruption and incompetence. Sounds familiar.
Yeah, some things never change.
So how did Portugal try to fix this mess?
Well, they eventually appointed a governor general to oversee the entire colony.
Trying to centralize things a bit?
Exactly. And this kind of coincided with the rise of a commodity that would totally transform Brazil. Sugar.
Ah, yes, the sugar rush. So this wasn't just like a few small farms here and there.
Oh, no. We're talking massive plantations churning out sugar to feed Europe's insatiable sweet tooth.
But that kind of boom usually comes at a cost, right?
You got it. The demand for labor led to a dark chapter in Brazil's history, the transatlantic slave trade.
So many lives uprooted and destroyed for profit.
Exactly. It's estimated that by 1700, over 963,000 enslaved Africans were working on those plantations.
A truly devastating legacy.
One that Brazil is still grappling with today.
So sugar dominated Brazil's economy for a while, but then something changed, didn't it? What about the gold rush?
Right. In the late 17th century, gold was discovered in the interior.
Like a Brazilian gold rush, like California.
Very similar, but maybe even more impactful for Brazil.
In what way?
Well, think about it. It wasn't just about people striking it rich. The gold rush brought thousands of new people to Brazil.
Changing the demographics.
Exactly. And not just that. New towns sprang up, roads were built, the whole interior was being rapidly developed. The gold rush really transformed Brazil.
I can see how that would make Brazil even more attractive to Portugal.
Absolutely. Portugal was determined to hold on tight to this valuable colony.
But their ambitions didn't stop there.
No, they started pushing westward into the Amazon, wanting to expand their control even further.
And of course, that led to some conflicts.
Oh, yeah. Big time. They clashed with the English and the Dutch, who also had their eyes on that territory.
So now we have Brazil booming, but firmly under Portugal's thumb.
A recipe for tension.
And then enter Napoleon.
Yeah, things are about to get really interesting. The year 1807 was a major turning point.
What happened?
Well, Napoleon invaded Portugal, forcing the royal family to flee.
Yeah, they went crazy.
Brazil. They sought refuge in their colony.
Wow. So Rio de Janeiro became the center of the Portuguese Empire.
It did. King John VI, the Portuguese king, set up shop in Rio.
That must have been a huge shift for Brazil.
It was. Not just symbolically, but practically, too. King John VI did something really significant.
What's that?
He opened up Brazilian ports to trade with other nations.
So no more being restricted to just trading with Portugal.
Exactly. This was huge. It allowed Brazil to connect with the wider world, establish new relationships, and it really boosted their economy.
It sounds like the seeds of independence were starting to be sown.
For sure. And, things were relatively peaceful and prosperous for a while there.
But it couldn't last forever, could it?
Sadly, no. Change was coming, and it would bring new challenges for Brazil and its relationship with Portugal.
We'll have to wait until next time to hear all about it, though.
Stay tuned. It's going to be a wild ride.
Okay, so last time we left off with Brazil kind of thriving under King John VI's rule, right? It was a period of unprecedented freedom and prosperity.
Yeah, a real turning point for Brazil.
But like all good things, it couldn't last forever.
True, true. Back in Portugal, there was this growing movement for change.
A movement? What kind?
It was a liberal revolution, actually. It kicked off in 1820, and the revolutionaries, well, they wanted a constitutional monarchy.
Oh, interesting. So limiting the king's power.
Exactly. And they also demanded that King John VI return to Lisbon.
Wow. So he was being pulled back to Portugal?
Yeah, it was a tricky situation for him. He was caught between, the demands of his people back home and this new reality he had created in Brazil.
I can only imagine the pressure he was under.
It must have been intense. Ultimately, though, he decided to return to Portugal.
Leaving Brazil behind.
Well, not completely. He left his son, Prince Pedro, in charge as regent of Brazil.
Ah, so new ruler, new challenges.
For sure. And Pedro was young, relatively untested. There was definitely a sense of uncertainty in the air.
Did the Brazilians see him favorably? Did they think he'd continue his father's, more liberal policies?
That was the big question. But even more than Pedro himself, it was the Portuguese Cortes, their parliament, that was causing a lot of tension.
In what way?
Well, the Cortes was dominated by those who, let's just say they weren't too happy about Brazil's newfound autonomy.
So they wanted to reel it back in?
Yeah, pretty much. They saw Brazil as this cash cow, a source of wealth that needed to be tightly controlled.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Right. And they started passing all these decrees that limited Pedro's authority, revoked some of Brazil's trade freedoms, and get this, they even demanded that Pedro return to Portugal.
Oh, wow. So they were really trying to put the squeeze on Brazil.
They were. And, it wasn't just about economics. There was this undercurrent of, disrespect, almost a sense of looking down on Brazil and Pedro.
That never goes over well.
It didn't. The Cortes' actions really backfired because they only fueled the growing sentiment for independence in Brazil.
And how did Prince Pedro react to all of this? Was he just going to take it lying down?
Well, at first, he tried to play it safe. He agreed to send some Brazilian troops back to Portugal, and he even made a public statement reaffirming his loyalty to his father.
So trying to appease both sides.
Yeah, but the Cortes saw that as a sign of weakness.
And they just kept pushing.
Exactly. They revoked even more of his powers and eventually issued a direct order for him to return to Lisbon, immediately.
So much for diplomacy.
Right. They completely misjudged the situation and ended up pushing Pedro right into the arms of the Brazilian independence movement.
It seems like they just kept making things worse for themselves.
That's often how it goes with these power struggles.
Probably.
Anyway, in June 1822, Pedro took a big step. He called for the election of deputies to form a constituent assembly in Brazil.
Ooh, that's bold.
It was. This was a clear sign that he was serious about creating a framework for self-governance separate from Portugal.
So things were definitely escalating.
But he still hadn't formally declared independence, right?
Right. So what happened? What was the final push?
It all came down to some urgent letters. While Pedro was on this trip to São Paulo trying to rally support, he got word from back in Rio.
From who?
From José Bonifacio, a key advisor, and his wife, Princess Maria Leopoldina.
Ah, okay. And what did those letters say?
They told him that the Cortes had completely gone off the deep end. They had revoked all of his authority and were even sending ships to bring him back to Portugal by force if necessary.
Wow. So no more messing around.
Exactly. Pedro realized that the time for talking was over.
And this was the lead up to the famous cry of Ipiranga.
It was. We'll have to delve into that next time, but let's just say things were about to get very interesting for Brazil, Portugal, and Prince Pedro.
I can't wait to hear all about it. So last time, things were getting pretty tense, huh? Prince Pedro was stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Absolutely, with the Portuguese Cortes breathing down his neck, demanding his return, and trying to strip Brazil of its newfound freedom.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, they really miscalculated the situation, thinking they could just strong-arm Pedro and Brazil back into submission.
So what happened next? Did Pedro just give in and head back to Portugal?
Well, not quite. Initially, he did try to kind of play both sides, appease the Cortes without completely betraying Brazil.
So walking a tightrope.
Exactly. He agreed to send some Brazilian troops back to Portugal and even made a public statement about staying loyal to his father, King John VI.
But the Cortes didn't really buy it, did they?
Nope. They saw it as weakness and just kept pushing, revoking even more of his authority and eventually issuing a direct order for him to return to Lisbon, immediately.
Wow. Talk about an ultimatum.
It really was. And that pretty much sealed the deal, It pushed Pedro to finally side with the Brazilian independence movement.
So this is the turning point.
Yeah, you could say that. In June of 1822, Pedro took a major step by calling for elections for a constituent assembly in Brazil.
Bold move. So he was basically setting the stage for self-governance separate from Portugal.
Exactly. He was starting to lay the groundwork for a potential break, but he still hadn't formally declared independence, you know?
Right. So what finally pushed him over the edge? What was the final straw?
It all came down to some pretty urgent letters. While Pedro was on a trip to São Paulo trying to drum up support, he got word from back in Rio de Janeiro.
Oh, who was it from?
From José Bonifacio, a close advisor, and his wife, Princess Maria Leopoldina.
And what did they say? What was the big news?
Basically, they told him that the Cortes had completely lost it. They'd gone and revoked all of his authority and were even sending ships to bring him back to Portugal by force if necessary.
Wow, things just escalated really quickly.
Yeah, they sure did. The Cortes really overplayed their hand there, you know.
So no more Mr. Nice Guy.
Pretty much. Pedro realized that diplomacy had run its course. There was no going back.
So this was it, the lead up to the famous Cry of Ipiranga.
Exactly. On September 7th, 1822, on the banks of the Ipiranga River, he made a declaration that would change the course of Brazilian history.
What a moment. Do we know exactly what he said? I mean, did he just shout independence? Or was there more to it?
Well, according to eyewitness accounts, he tore off the blue and white armband, you know, the one that symbolized Portugal.
Wow, dramatic.
And he declared, "Armbands off, soldiers. Hail to the independence, to freedom, and to the separation of Brazil from Portugal." And then, to really drive the point home, he unsheathed his sword and proclaimed, "For my blood, my honor, my God, I swear to give Brazil freedom, independence, or death."
Chills. What a powerful scene. So a young prince defying his own family and a powerful empire for the sake of freedom. That's the stuff of legends.
It really is. And, you know, news of Pedro's declaration spread throughout Brazil like wildfire, sparking celebrations and a surge of national pride.
I bet. It must have felt like a huge weight had been lifted.
Absolutely. When he returned to Rio de Janeiro, he was greeted by cheering crowds, hailing him as the liberator of Brazil. The momentum for independence was unstoppable.
But Portugal wasn't just going to let its most valuable colony slip away without a fight, right? What happened next?
You're right. Portugal refused to acknowledge Brazilian independence, and war broke out.
So the fight for freedom continued, even after the declaration.
Exactly. The War of Independence, which lasted from 1822 to 1824, was fought across Brazil, on land and at sea.
This wasn't just some symbolic conflict. It was a real struggle with real consequences.
Definitely. And there were some key players on the Brazilian side who really made a difference. Like Thomas Cochrane, a British naval officer with a lot of experience fighting for revolutionary causes.
So, a seasoned veteran in the fight for freedom.
You could say that. He was instrumental in organizing the Brazilian Navy and securing some crucial victories against the Portuguese fleet.
So, turning the tide of the war.
Exactly. One crucial victory happened in April 1823 at the Battle of Itaparica in Bahia.
Okay, and what happened there?
The Brazilian Navy, under Cochrane's command, totally crushed the Portuguese fleet, effectively cutting off their supply lines and solidifying Brazilian control over the region.
Wow. A decisive blow. Did Portugal finally admit defeat after that? Or did they keep fighting?
Well, they held on for a while longer, but after a string of defeats and mounting international pressure, they finally relented.
So Brazil finally achieves full independence.
Yes. In 1825, they signed the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro, which formally recognized Brazil as an independent nation.
What a journey. But we talked earlier about how independence isn't a magic solution, right?
Yeah.
What were some of the challenges Brazil faced as a young nation?
Well, one of the biggest challenges was the legacy of slavery. I mean, Brazil's economy was built on it, so the transition to a free society was going to be a long and difficult one.
Heavy burden to carry.
It was. And it would continue to shape Brazil's history for many years to come.
So Brazil's road to independence was a long and winding one, filled with political intrigue, economic shifts, and even war.
And it reminds us that achieving independence is just the first step. Building a nation is a constant process, filled with challenges and opportunities.
And that's what makes history so fascinating, right? It's full of these turning points that shape the world we live in.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that the past is never really past. It's always with us, shaping our present and influencing our future.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Brazilian independence. It's been a truly enlightening journey.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy exploring these pivotal moments in history.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as we have. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the stories that make up our world. Until next time.